Today's rehearsal of the Singapore Symphony won on all counts. They run through the evening's program. Lan Shui, the orchestra's music director, fine-tunes their performance. They push forth. But tonight's concert will be a milestone in the history of the Singapore Symphony Orchestra. Not only is it the first concert of the new millennium, it is the concert that celebrates the 21st anniversary of the SSO. It's a significant number, not only because there are 21 in the 21st century, but because, as the number implies, it is a coming of age for what could possibly be called the little orchestra that could.
Well, I was asked to meet Dr. Goh sometime in 1977. It must have been the second half of 77, and he asked me whether I thought it was time to set up a national orchestra, and I said, yes, why not? And then he asked me who we could get to conduct or lead the orchestra. Of course, Choo Huey's name sprang to mind because we all knew about Choo Huey. Mr. Choo by then had a pretty successful conducting career in Europe, and therefore he asked me to write to Mr. Choo to see whether he would be interested.
One day I received a letter, and it was written by Dr. Bernard Tan, and I think at the behest of then Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and telling me that Singapore has an intention to form an orchestra, and asked whether I would be able to return to Singapore to start this orchestra. That's how it all began.
Starting an orchestra from scratch was no small task, even for a conductor like Choo Huey with 2 decades of experience. He immediately set about the first order of business, finding the musicians.
I was at that point teaching violin full-time, and I was so happy to be able to, realize my dream of performing in a professional orchestra. So, of course, I went for the auditions, and Choo Huey was there auditioning, and we had 8 locals to begin with, and this was way back in December 1978.
8 musicians were barely enough to form a symphony orchestra, so Choo Huey embarked on an overseas mission, recruiting musicians from Korea, China, and as far away as the United States.
My important mission was to get the most skillful and talented musician, but at the same time, I also make a point to see that those musicians, preferably, will be able to stay in Singapore on a long-term basis, or to eventually make Singapore as their home, so that the stability of the orchestra can be established.
The Singapore Symphony Orchestra made its debut with a series of inaugural concerts in January 1979. The concerts were a rousing success, and it looked like the orchestra was on its way. Sadly, however, Choo Huey's dream of maintaining stability would have to wait. Within a year of these concerts, half of the musicians would leave.
There was some teething problem then, you see. Our first recruitment, first batch of the recruit musicians, they were quite young and inexperienced. Now, with all this, the American players, they were well trained and so on, and they thought, you see, that to have an orchestra with a mixed standard of players was not conducive to their personal development as far as from an artistic point of view.
I think there were lots of little issues, cultural issues, musical issues, and in any case, turnover in most orchestras, especially when they're young, is usually quite high, actually, you know. But those were the early days. We learned a lot from what happened in those days, actually.
Young, idealistic musicians were not the only challenges facing this fledgling orchestra. The young, inexperienced management and staff had to cope with a myriad of administrative details. There were moments when pieces of music didn't arrive before a concert, and the program had to be changed at the last minute.
It was really starting from scratch, so everything had to be put together. Including the office staff and even the office stationery things, you know, and getting the music was also quite difficult, I think, in those days. We had to get a lot of music from the National Library and wherever we could get. We also didn't have a proper hall to rehearse in. We used to rehearse in the PUB auditorium, and the stage was too small, so we had to use the floor space.
We started the SSO really from zero, from scratch. There wasn't anything, and we did it ourselves. We didn't ask any other people to help us. It was done entirely by ourselves. No big management agencies or musicians agents were there to help us. But I think having got Mr. Choo to agree to come and be the music director was a really good start, of course.
Despite all these challenges, the orchestra staff and Choo Huey persevered. Choo Huey would lead the orchestra for another 16 years, and today, as conductor emeritus of the SSO, can reflect on what it took to build Singapore's first professional performing arts group.
Well, of course, to establish very good orchestras, they require four elements, you see. First of all, you have to recruit very skillful and good musicians. Second, there must be a conductor who is willing to stay close with the orchestra and work and establish very intimate relationship in terms of ensemble playing. And thirdly, you must have good administrations to support. Fourth, and the audience attendance is very important to give the incentive for the musician to perform on the stage.
Whether the SSO lived up to Choo Huey's criteria would be a constant source of discussion over the next 2 decades of its growth and development. But the one observation no one could deny was that for the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, there would be no turning back.
And performing at Washington seems to be child's play?
I enjoy playing for the audience and for the people.
Lee Hui-min takes the stage in Washington Sunday on Arts Center.
Early years of the SSO were marked by birth pangs. The period after saw a concerted attempt to put the orchestra on the world map.
Well, my, of course, personal ambitions is to be able to build up this orchestra to an international standard. If you want to compare, you must compare with the best. And I'm not the one who is happy that because our neighboring country do not have an orchestra, we have an orchestra, one-upmanship. So, you see, that is not really my point, you see. My point is just to build an orchestra, that orchestra can be compared with Western established orchestra.
Thank you.
This is take 1.
Producing their first CD, which contained a performance of local composer Leong Yunpin's Dayung Sampan, was a step in that direction.
We went for a European tour 4 times, and in fact the orchestra was not unfamiliar in those countries and or cities such as London, Paris, Milan, Budapest, Prague, Bucharest, and Sweden, Stockholm, Oslo, and Copenhagen.
On home ground, a campaign was launched to woo the general public with events like outdoor concerts in the Botanic Gardens. However, wooing the masses and nurturing the orchestra sometimes required different approaches.
Mandate was given to build a first-class orchestra. At the same time, to be able to attract the public. Now, these two is very difficult to reconcile in a sense, you see, that if you are going to build up an orchestra, the best vitamin for the orchestras, of course, is Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and all the development from Bach period up till the 20th century music. Now, if you are going to attract the public, then you are going to play all these pop music stuff.
I think Choo Huey often felt that building an orchestra from scratch and developing an orchestra meant that you expose them to a wide variety of music. And he was, of course, very interested in contemporary music. And he wanted the orchestra to learn new works quite often. Now, against that, yeah, building an audience, it's quite true that an audience generally would like the more popular works. But in a sense, you know, he used to tell me that the Singapore audience is a fresh audience. It's like, this is like a blank or white piece of paper, and therefore he felt to some extent that because they didn't have any preconceived notions, people could come to the concerts and perhaps listen to contemporary works and enjoy them as much as they might Rachmaninoff or Tchaikovsky or Beethoven.
The debate between playing more challenging pieces and then you stick words like avant-garde that frightens off certain people, or between that extreme and the other extreme that it's only a commercially based orchestra, it's in a way a false debate. I believe that any extreme is to be avoided. It's also linked to the more fundamental question, what is the mission of this orchestra? Is this orchestra the national orchestra of the country? Is this orchestra a commercially based enterprise? Is this orchestra somewhere in between and has to cater to both? Obviously, that will influence the program. In any case, I think the ideal is that the quality of the playing is such that you create a regular, faithful audience who will trust the orchestra, and they will come, they like their orchestra, they know whether that piece is familiar or unfamiliar, they are going to get a top performance.
One way of keeping the orchestra on its toes is to invite guest conductors who can help broaden the musicians' exposure to different styles and approaches. Finnish conductor Oko Kamu has been a guest conductor of the SSO since 1985. He remembers his early concerts here and the magnitude of the changes that have taken place.
Enormous, of course. I think we struggled through Sibelius' Fifth Symphony, and I thought in the first rehearsal that this will never be ready for the concert. And we also played Liszt piano concerto. That was a bit better, but the strange sounds of Sibelius were not very familiar with the orchestra then. And now I see that they play Sibelius last week, next season, so it's like a household composer, and many others also. I don't mean that Mr. Choo didn't play Sibelius. I think that he introduced a very, very broad repertoire to the audience.
In 1996, after 17 years at the helm of the SSO, Choo Huey decided it was time to move on. Enter Lan Shui, a China-born US-based composer who had conducted, among others, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, the Detroit Symphony, and the New York Philharmonic.
When Choo Huey announced his retirement and they approached me, I think to me it's very exciting. The excitement to me is I'm taking not only an orchestra, it's taking an Asian orchestra. And it's good Asian orchestra. Because there are not many good Asian orchestra has their rich tradition yet. But you can see the potentials there. Europe and US, the orchestra already is pretty much settled. You go from first year to fifth year, you don't see the difference. But here, I can feel you can make difference.
To make a difference, Lan Shui first had to make a candid assessment of the orchestra.
The strength is this orchestra have so many wonderful stars, or in other words, so many wonderful players, but not quite even. Some weak player too. On the other hand, if let's say the weakness, at times I think they play individually really good, but as an ensemble, that's a need time to think. You need train the orchestra, and the orchestra musician need also have chamber music experience, because the orchestra, 90 people, but it's just like chamber music. You have to listen, collaborate with each other.
If Choo Huey's mandate was to build the orchestra, Lan Shui's mission would be to build on Choo Huey's legacy.
Today, the SSO it's a much more confident ensemble. I think their ensemble playing is very much improved, and the sectional playing, particularly in the wind and brass, is much better. But I want to say one thing, and that is, no matter how improved the SSO is today compared to January 79, when they first struck up their first notes in 1979 January, I think there was several orders of magnitude improvement between that first SSO concert and anything that had been performed in Singapore by any Singapore orchestra. It was just a different level of competence. And I think that's something that we have to credit to Choo Huey. He didn't compromise in his early standards. He brought in the best 8 Singapore players and built an orchestra which at the inaugural concert was of a standard which stood it alongside the better orchestras of the world immediately.
In any organization, artistic or otherwise, there are always points of reflection and renewal. The arrival of Lan Shui heralded a changing of the musical guard. But on the management front, there were changes too.
When I came on board the SSO has already 20 years of history. Most of the administrative systems and procedures are already laid down. They have a system of remuneration for the musicians. They have their own programming principles and so on. I don't think so. It was like, starting from basic principles. Before I came on board the SSO, the perception was you have an orchestra that seems to be distancing itself, from the mainstream of the local arts community. I think I perceive that the orchestra was, was becoming not accessible to the general population. It was not close to the people.
Building, or rather rebuilding the audience for the SSO would require a re-evaluation of existing programs as well as the introduction of new ones.
From this season, every concert, we start a pre-concert talk for every concert. So people can come here early to learn the stories or learn the background. And the second thing also, we're doing casual concert. It's on Sunday. audience can ask questions. They can ask all kinds of questions. Sometimes even the question come up as, what's your favorite food? But I don't mind even they ask nothing to do with music. But the thing is, we make more connect.
Rather than settle for an exclusively adult audience, the SSO decided to start from bottom up. With a music education program in place, events like the first music festival for children represented a fertile ground for grooming a larger audience and perhaps even potential SSO musicians of the future. Lan Shui also took the SSO back into the recording studios, producing 4 new CDs in 2 years.
Today, I must say that we have established a growing reputation for our music, so much so that it has even attracted the attention of BIS, the international recording label.
Surprisingly, all the magazines from BBC magazine, Times, and the German classical music magazine, all the magazines give very positive review.
Now that the orchestra had been exposed to a wide repertoire of 18th, 19th and 20th century European composers, it was time to look closer to home.
Now, should it play the music of Asian and in particular Singapore composers? I think as a Singapore composer, I'm biased, of course. We have to do that. But why? This is an Asian orchestra. If, like any orchestra, it performs the music of contemporary composers, it must represent the Asian ethos in its repertoire, no question about that. And even more, being a Singapore orchestra, it is the only avenue by which Singapore composers can have their works performed, and therefore the only way that their works can have a life of any sort. And I think most orchestras in different countries around the world take it as a matter of course that when they perform concerts at home, and even more particularly when they travel abroad, they play the works of their own country's composers.
I think Asian orchestra gradually should promote more Asian music. Of course, on the main stage, we still play tonight Prokofiev, last week Strauss still. But you may notice on our program, once in a while we always put Asian composer. This season we have Shan, Chinese composer, and also local composers.
Sinfonietta No. 4 by Associate Professor Bernard Tan was one of 6 new local compositions commissioned by the SSO to celebrate their 20th anniversary. A sure sign that the SSO was entering the new millennium with a redefined mission. However, if the business of managing 40 musicians was a delicate task in the early years of the orchestra, the challenge of managing 90 musicians in its late teenage years would be a test of the SSO's maturity. While in the early years of the SSO it was necessary to recruit foreign musicians, it became an issue now that it was coming of age whether a national orchestra shouldn't be purely made of locally born musicians.
In every other country which has a 100-year history or 150-year history of art making, music making, or any art group, they will always treasure their own local talent first before they open their doors to foreign talent. And I think if you want to open your doors to foreign talent, it's wonderful for the input. But the bottom line is we should all be treated fairly. We should be all given the same opportunities and the same chances to perform.
I think the musicians have got to be objective about this. You look at the number of musicians who are trained in Singapore. They are mostly trained in piano or violin. How often do you find musicians trained in the oboe or the bassoon? And it is in these instruments that we are lacking. And if we are lacking in these instruments for which we couldn't find Singaporeans to fill the vacancies, the next obvious cause for the management would be to look overseas to, for such musicians.
Having reached a certain level of recognition with its outside audience meant that the SSO could now turn inwards and re-examine its day-to-day processes. And this sometimes meant questioning whether the business of making music really served the art of making music well.
We're not just a business organization. We are a musical organization. To upkeep our standards and to upkeep our growth musically as well as internationally in the scene, we should definitely get our administration act together as well. Very important is key staff. They should understand the artistic management. They should understand the orchestra works, how it works, and how to deal with musicians.
I know the musicians are clamoring for better staff benefits, clamoring for better facilities. They also want clearer channels of communication between the management and the professionals, the musicians. They are also asking for the management to be more open. So all these factors are important, and which, of course, we try to accommodate them as much as we could. Although I must say that we don't believe in playing to the gallery. And if we could accommodate them within reasonable bounds of, our capability to assist, I think we would have done well.
The SSO as a business enterprise, indeed, it's not a profit-making enterprise, but it has to be run on the same business principles as any other enterprise. It requires management staff with the same sorts of, say, accounting expertise and marketing expertise that you find anywhere else. And in fact, in these areas, I think I would say I would rather have a person who is a good marketer or good accountant, even though that person might not have musical experience. Of course, musical knowledge and indeed musical appreciation helps a lot. But these are professional areas in which you have to have someone with the marketing know-how or the accounting know-how or whatever, which helps the SSO be a more effective enterprise.
It wasn't so much that the challenges faced by the orchestra were unique. It was really that the SSO itself was unique. As one of the pioneering professional symphony orchestras of Southeast Asia, they had no precedents to follow, no models to adopt. And just as they were thrust into being by sheer passion and determination, they would have to charge into the 21st century, anticipating, but not really knowing.
Brand new collection of classic tracks from one of the world's greatest composers.
The SSO has collaborated with a number of renowned soloists in its 20-year history. But what makes the soloists for their 21st anniversary concert significant is the fact that they are internationally renowned and Singapore-born.
I think just through the passage of time and, of course, all the work with Choo Huey and different conductors, I think there's been a natural process of maturation as well. So it's become much tighter, I feel, much more efficient.
However, even with the maturation of the orchestra over the years and the Singapore music scene in general, the three soloists, like many Singapore-born musicians, choose to pursue their careers abroad.
I think also when we go overseas and study, which I think anyone really serious would have to do, we've built ourselves a network, and it's very difficult to step out of because it's a very comfortable network. And then coming back to a place like home should be easy, but it's actually quite a large step, not to be at all underestimated.
The business side of music in Singapore that is relatively young. In fact, I think we have lack of managers and the support staff that help artists and performers, you know. I think there's definitely lack of that. A strong enough, powerful agency that can leverage with the big guys in the West. And I think it's been difficult.
Perhaps then, at this juncture, almost exactly 21 years from the date of its inaugural concerts, it's time for the SSO to pause and reflect.
You know, what the SSO did really was it brought professionalism into the Singapore performing arts scene with a vengeance in the sense that, you know, before the SSO, you did not have performing arts professionals making a living full-time. And here, all of a sudden, here were 42 people plus a music director being paid professional full-time salaries. And I think that has been a watershed in Singapore's performing arts history, really.
My assessment is that the SSO has, over the years, helped to enliven the local art scene through its weekly concerts on Friday and Saturday. Without fail, we have weekend concerts to inject life into our local art scene. That is an most important contribution. The second area of contribution I see is the employment opportunities provided for trained musicians.
The SSO also enters the new millennium with a new corporate image, a new logo, and a new mission: to be a world-class national orchestra that bridges the gap between the musical traditions of Asia and the West. In the final analysis, though, how does it measure up to other renowned orchestras of the world?
I think the SSO should not be compared to these orchestras which exist for 150 years because the situation is different, and also the relation and the nature and maybe the mission of these orchestras are different. And an orchestra is part of a whole society, and you cannot just take one situation at that time with that kind of evolution, at that point of its evolution, and compare it with another point in time and geography.
It's not fair to compare because, I mean, if they are a personal ensemble, personal instrument, I mean, that's much more valuable than that they have to match with the Vienna Philharmonic or Berlin Philharmonic, whatever. I mean, individuality is very important, and they have their kind of way of playing, which I enjoy.
At 21, the SSO is a symphony orchestra in its infancy. It will take many more years to build the history and tradition that one associates with older orchestras of Europe and America. But that is precisely why these are exciting times for the Singapore Symphony Orchestra.
Well, look at this way. Singapore itself is a young nation. We have never let that bother us, you know, in trying to achieve international standards. The SSO is 21. It is a very young age for an orchestra. But I think that means that we don't have any baggage which which drags us down, you know. And I think it enables us to do things which are new and fresh and not have any preconceived notions, to think out of the box, to do things which will attract a new audience, and particularly a young audience, which is not interested in whether your orchestra is 200 years old, but they're much more interested in whether your orchestra is relevant and plays music which interests them.
The freedom to chart its own future and develop recognition on its own terms are qualities of an organization that has come of age.
We have a relatively short history, and therefore we are in better positions to accept new ideas and to adjust ourselves to, you know, to the kind of change environment that we are witnessing. In terms of the orchestra itself, of course, we want to, you know, recruit the best musicians that we could afford to play better music and to give greater resonance to SSO sounds. Administratively, we also need to look into strengthening the administrative structure to provide career opportunities for the administrative staff. And overall, we hope that we are able to weld the various musicians into a unified whole. Musicians who are happy working in the orchestra, musicians who are committed and dedicated to the organization, and musicians who are passionate about raising the level of music playing to help us establish an ensemble of world standing.
If we want to settle down for a higher standard, as I think what our music director wants presently, it should be done completely anew, and we should maybe just revamp the entire orchestra.
I think it's working already much better than before. Still, we have to have a lot of things to learn, really in music yet. Their administration, to me, I think should be more connect.
I would like to see the SSO become an orchestra which is relevant to the Singapore scene as a whole, an orchestra which is recognized by everyone, from the chief executive in a multinational company to the taxi driver who acknowledges that he might not go to SSO concerts, but he knows the SSO and is proud of the SSO as a Singapore orchestra. And that's the sort of institution I would like the SSO to become.
Like a piece of music which is open to different interpretations, the SSO will continue to generate analysis, discussion, and criticism. It is, after all, young and still evolving. Is it world-class today? Does it have a long way to go? And will there be many more challenges ahead? The answers are not readily apparent, but perhaps it doesn't really matter when a performance begins and ends, when the conductor has united 90 people into a single mind, when each musician has given his or her best, and the audience can leave the concert hall with their hearts moved and their souls stirred.
Stay with us now when High Notes returns next with a sensational Easter musical with renowned soprano Jessie Norman.